So that's great that we learned all about the nature of nonlinear editing, but we wanted to learn about the process of how to actually do it, right? Because that's what we're here for, is to actually make stuff. So this lesson should give you a brief overview of what the entire process is going to be like, and then we'll have some separate video tutorials that show you how to do these steps in Final Cut Pro. Excellent. Okay, so the first thing that you need to do is you've got footage on your camera, and you need to get that into the computer, right? Because the computer is where we're going to do all of our editing. But what we've got here is actually a video tape that has all of our footage on it. And we need to get that somehow into the computer so that we can start doing our editing. So this is called the capture process. And oftentimes it is conflated with another process called logging. So capturing is actually the mechanical method of doing exactly this, going from camera to computer. And the cool thing about this is that since it's all digital, it's all just ones and zeros. There's no data loss that comes in to play here. Exactly what is on your tape gets copied bit for bit exactly into the computer. So that's pretty cool. That's one of the great things about digital video, is that you're not losing quality. And then in addition to that, while that's going on, there's also this idea of doing something called logging. And this is done with axes, and you go out into the forest and cut down trees. And if you think my sense of humor is dry and boring, then you got it right. No, actually, logging is a process of organization where you are going through your source material and making notes, basically, of what is on the tape and which parts of it that you want. So you're actually going through, before you capture, you're actually sort of shuttling through and finding the individual shots that you want, and you're marking sort of the in and out points of that. So this is sort of gone by the wayside with modern technology, but you'll still see this term often used along with capture, logging and capture. So that's what that means. And then once you've got all that footage into the computer, the editor's main job at that point is, like with logging, is to organize. One of the biggest challenges, obviously, of putting together a movie is that you've got a lot of parts. And instead of having them, splayed out all over the place, a good editor will sort of create a couple of different buckets for that material, so that shots that are all from the same scene will be put together and named something accordingly, and different types of footage and different types of media. So maybe if you have, some audio files, you'll have some of that here and kept separate. And the organization process is again very important to editing, and is one of the big things that we'll be dealing with as this process goes on. And part of that organization is to actually choose from a big long clip that you shot on set, and we're going to run this sideways because it's a linear progression. So this is a whole clip that you shot, and we'll talk about shooting coverage and the way that we shoot. But you've got a lot of stuff at the beginning, and then you've got a lot of stuff at the end, but the real meat of your shot is going to be, these middle frames. You're like, okay, that's actually the part that I want, because there was a bunch of stuff at the beginning where we were just getting the camera rolling, and there's a bunch of stuff at the end where the person said cut, and they looked at the camera and said blah, blah, blah. So you're not going to use the entire clip. You just want to use this bit of it. So if this is a clip, then this inside part is actually a sub clip, because it is a subsection of the entire clip. So part of organizing is going through and picking out the portions of longer takes that you want to use, and snipping them out and creating sub clips out of those, so that you have the sort of just the meat part, just the good parts, and you don't have to worry when you start putting those things in sequence. You won't have all this extraneous stuff out here jogging being sort of glaring and taking you out of the story. So here you're sort of trimming it down to the actual meat. And then you get to the fun part. This is the part that you do a lot, and this is again, placing the shots in sequence. Choosing shot 1, and then putting shot 2, and then shot 3, and so on and so forth. You create something called a sequence, which is a little container, and you put these shots in there to make a sequence. And that's basically the job of an editor. One shot after another shot after another shot. And then, of course, the beauty of this system is that you can go in and start rearranging after that. So you can swap shots out, or you can make this one actually a little bit longer, and you can make this one a little bit shorter, and all those great things. And again, like we said with the previous video, this is the beauty of nonlinear editing, is you can do and undo all this stuff ad infinitum in pretty much real time and see what it looks like and find your best picture in a pretty rapid way. So, rearranging, I think, is what I'd call this step. After you put them in a sequence, then you can rearrange that sequence. And this is going to be most of what you spend your time doing. And then after this, you have to actually take your sort of finished end piece. You've got a nice sort of video that plays from start to finish at this point. And what you want to do is test it. You want to actually show this video to an audience and get some feedback from them. Say, what did you think? This is sort of like a screening, basically, or a rough screening of the individual stuff, and find out what they say. Did they love it? Did they have questions? Did it make them feel happy? Did it make them feel nothing? So you get that feedback from people by testing your edits and showing them to people. And this can be other people in your group. This could be an internal audience, or it could be just random people that you pull out from the street to watch your video. And all of that feedback can be, really good, because what you'll then do is you will use that information to revise and reiterate on your process. So at that point where you rearrange and test, that goes on a lot. You rearrange it, you test it and see how it looks, and then you rearrange it and test it and see how it looks, and you rearrange it and test it and see how it looks, and on and on and on and so forth, until you get it to the way that you want it. And so the refining process takes you from your very roughest version of the movie all the way to the one that you're going to actually submit for people to actually see. So the beginning of that process, the first thing that you do, we usually call this an assembly cut. An assembly cut is where you take pretty much everything that you've got and you put it in order just to make the actual sequence of events make sense. So, you get your beginning, your middle, and your end all there, but they're really not meant to be watched as a story. They're just there to show that, okay, this is the start, this is the middle, and this is the end, but I'm not really sure about, there's no fine tuning in terms of these transitions and the points at which they overlap. You'll probably have a lot of overlap of action between the beginning and ends of those clips, the beginning and ends of those clips, and so there's a lot of refining that needs to go on. But what this step does is show you that yes, I do have all the raw materials I need to tell this story. It's probably like way too long. Movie assembly cuts will be 4 hours long. Let me enjoy a sip of my mango smoothie. Refreshing. But it's where you have to start to make sure that you've got what you need. This is a step where you will identify big missing things like, I forgot to get that shot that showed that the hero was actually a cyborg, and that's kind of important to the rest of the movie. So think this is where you will identify stuff that you still need to shoot. And so that's one of the reasons that you don't go in and start fine tuning everything, because it's like, oh well, it turns out that we still need some stuff, and this order of these things is going to change, so we're not going to polish this. We're not going to put down the first shot and then massage it, say, oh no, it needs to be about 6 frames shorter, and oh yeah, I'm going to flip it over so it's left to right instead of right to left, and then I'm gonna put some color correction on that, and yeah, I'm gonna do the audio and fix the audio levels on that, and then I'm gonna start with my next shot, and then I'm gonna, oh wait, actually this shot should be the first shot, so you know what, scratch all of that, I don't need that shot, what I need is this shot. So obviously you don't want to do that. You don't want to do all of this work and get this one thing super perfect, and then find out that the next chunk of your story is really actually where it needs to begin, because of the material, the raw material that you have to work with. So this is what we call sort of the refining workflow, sort of the iterative method, where you're not starting out with fine tuning. Save fine tuning for the last. This is sort of like carpentry, and obviously I know all kinds of stuff about carpentry, but the little bit that I do know is that, you don't start off with the fine sandpaper and getting the little details right. You start off, with big chunks of wood, and then, you cut those up, and then you put them together to make a table, and then you take the table and you polish and sand that, and then finally you paint it. And so this is kind of a whack analogy, so I'm just going to slowly back away from it. But that's the idea, is that you're slowly refining and refining and refining until you get to what you want. So that assembly is the first thing that lets you know sort of structurally how your movie is doing. And then you get to what is probably the most misunderstood cut of them all, which is the rough cut. Now, the rough cut is means different things to different people. Internally, for just the editorial staff or the editor and the director, it can actually be pretty rough. There can be a bunch of things that aren't going to actually end up in the picture. It can look kind of crappy, but people know that there's still more process to be done. However, when you're in the professional world and you're doing this for somebody else, like you're cutting a commercial or something, they're going to ask to see rough cuts with finger quotes around them. And so clients, by definition, are not the most imaginative people in the world, right? If they had the ability to see things the way that you do and know the craft the way that you do, then they'd probably be doing this for themselves. So what you have to understand is that you have a different level of looking at things. You have more of a technical and an aesthetic imagination about what's actually missing and where this is going to go than they do. So you're going to be making a lot of assumptions about this that are different than your audiences, when your audience is sort of your client. So your rough cut actually needs to look pretty good. So you need to never show somebody a super actual rough cut, because they will start to lose confidence. They'll be like, oh, well, I really didn't want that to be so dark, and it's kind of choppy in the middle, and is that time code going to be on the shot? It's like all those things you sort of take for granted. It's like, oh yeah, I'm going to cut the picture of the dead cat out of there, and I'm not going to have like my hand in front of the frame for the half of this thing. All that kind of stuff, it needs to be out of there. So rough cut has a lot of different meanings to different people, but it's the next level where everything is there and you're starting to play around with the sequence of the shots. And then you start to get in, once you've got that down, once you've got the sequence of your shots and all of that done, then you start doing stuff that's called a fine cut. And a fine cut is where you start doing things like trimming. That's where we're taking an individual shot and saying, oh, you know what, I need a few extra frames of that at the end just to make it feel right. And actually those first 2 frames, we could actually come into the shot a little bit later, so we're going to get rid of those first 2 or 3 frames and start the shot right here, and it's going to end up over here. Things like that are things that you do in fine cuts, and changing the duration of a shot, or going through and if it's got some audio on it that you're like, oh well, I kind of want the audio for this shot to start while this shot's still going on, so that kind of fades us up into the next scene. I want to do something like that. This is the level where you start doing that, where you start working with overlapping, and you start thinking about your transitions. Is this going to fade crossfade across those two so the shot comes in while the shot's going out, or is it going to dip to black first and then come back up? All of that stuff is handled in the fine cut stage, and you don't want to get ahead of yourself doing a lot of these kind of in the weeds, really small, minuscule finishing touches early on, because what you're interested in early on is does the sequence make sense? Does the placement of the shots make sense? And here you're just kind of doing some more massaging. And then finally there's the what you're going to deliver to people. And this is called an answer print. And the reason we call it an answer print is this comes from the old days of film. And when the film was done and they would go through the color correction process, it was, it's a chemical process and mechanical. And so they would, take the director's ideas and run it through the machine and see how the print came out. But they knew that he was going to have to look at it and say, oh no, actually I think I need a little bit more magenta in there, and let's reduce the contrast by a hair. So they're called answer prints because you're sending it to somebody and you're going to get an answer on, is this done or not? And I've adopted this as an alternative to final. My experience in making videos is that nothing is ever final when you think it is, because there's always something that you either forgot that you see later and you have to go back and fix, or there's something that the client sees. So final is a word that should be reserved for actually after the project is done and you're archiving it and you're not going to mess with it anymore. So like that very last thing that you make right before you put it on a shelf somewhere, you can call that file final. But if you start putting the word final in at the answer print stage, you're going to end up with final 1, final 2, final 3, final 1, final 2, final 3, really actually sort of final, I think, final 7, and it gets really confusing, especially when you go back to sort of like to the project for, a year later to look at it and try to find which one of these was the final one. They all have the word final in it 7 times. So don't use that word. I like to use answer print, and this is where you basically, you're doing all the polishing, you're doing a color correction, and probably running it through your sound design and all of that, and then you're putting it out to the output medium. If it's going to be watched on DVD or on the web, you're uploading it and looking at it and going, okay, in its finished form, in its final form, the way that I want people to look at it, is this correct? And if it is, then yay, you're done. And if it's not, then you just go back and readjust until you get it right. And again, it's an iterative process. So that's where you're doing sort of the final polishing touches, the final finishing touches, and the minuscule things, little detail work to get it just right and perfect. So again, the process, very much like filmmaking, is a process of taking, the big sort of general ideas of Infinity and distilling them down into a script and into a storyboard and into footage, and finally like that. Editing is like that too, where you're gonna start with things that are increasingly sort of fine-tuned and getting closer to perfection. So I don't think that this illustration necessarily captures that, but when in doubt, put a smiley face on it, right? Fantastic. So that, in a nutshell, is the process of non-linear, wait for it, editing. Now, let's get into the specifics of how to do this with our system. So check out the tutorial videos on Final Cut Pro on how to do all of these steps, and we will get to the fun part of editing hands-on.